So this is a presentation on spying during the Cold War, during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which I was a active participant in. So let's get started. What we're going to look at today or learn is about why we spied, who ordered it, how we spied, and how the Bay of Pigs, of all things, changed spying and the technology of spying. So, who am I? I have a degree in physics, and I've attended some classes here at FGCU. But the key thing for this particular presentation is that I was an engineer on the Hexagon and Corona CIA satellite photo recon programs back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So I'm pulling back that experience and sharing it with you. So what kind of a physicist am I? I consider myself an engineering physicist. My first job out of college was in measurement standards as we were building the Atlas rocket. We certified the instruments used in the manufacturing of the rocket up to a millionth of an inch in some cases. So to get us started, I'm going to show a video. This video was produced by the National Reconnaissance Office to celebrate their 50th anniversary. Up until that point, which was in 2011, their name and even their initials were top secret for the 50 years in existence. The content of this video is really, really good. However, the audio is not, and you will need to listen carefully to hear what's going on. I apologize, but apparently the NRO is not very good at producing videos. So what it will highlight is the reconnaissance systems of the 60s and 80s, and it will explain how important they were for the intelligence. I'm going to try to embellish the stories without violating any classified information. So here we go. Mm-hmm. Whoops. I shouldn't have done that. We'll get it.
From Sticky in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe.
Late in 1954, President Eisenhower directed the Office of Defense Mobilization to conduct a threat analysis of a surprise attack from the Soviet Union. The report strongly recommended development of new capabilities for overhead collection. American scientists thought a reconnaissance spacecraft high in orbit could overcome the limitations of balloons and aircraft and provide wide area search of the Soviet Union and China. In July 1955, at the summit in Geneva, President Eisenhower proposed to the Soviet delegation a reciprocal reconnaissance overflight agreement called Open Skies. It was rejected. President Eisenhower wanted to know, what are their capabilities? What are their intentions? In 1958, with presidential authorization, the Air Force and the CIA began working on a top-secret program to develop systems to collect intelligence from space. This required inventing brand new technologies and operations. At first, progress was slow. In the meantime, the recently developed U-2 was used sparingly to photograph specific targets, such as airfields, radar installations, and missile test and launch sites. On the first attempt to cross the Soviet Union border to border, the U-2, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was brought down by a missile.
No one wants another Pearl Harbor.
This means that we must have knowledge of military forces and preparations around the world, especially those capable of massive surprise attack. Secrecy in the Soviet Union makes this essential. In most of the world, no large-scale attack could be prepared in secret. But in the Soviet Union, there is a fetus of secrecy and concealment. This is a major cause of international tension and uneasiness today.
On 10 August 1960, 3 months after the U-2 shootout, the U.S. launched the 13th attempt to successfully test a satellite imagery collection system. We retrieved a return capsule from the nation's first imagery satellite program, codenamed Corona. With this success, the U.S. began 50 years of imagery collection from space. For the next 12 years, Corona provided the much-needed look into the vast, denied areas of the communist bloc. Meanwhile, development teams worked hard to improve the program. And 3 years after Corona's first successful launch, the second-generation reconnaissance satellite, Gambit-1, was on orbit. It was essentially a powerful reflecting telescope camera in space. Also called KH-7, it had 3 times the focal length of Corona and provided an average of 1,000 photographs per mission of high-resolution imagery, answering many of the questions posed by the intelligence community. 3 years from the first Gambit launch, a more advanced imagery capability arose with the introduction of Gambit Cubed. Also known as KH-8, this new system boasted advanced capabilities, including a focal length over 7 times that of Corona, and a larger film payload made possible by thinner film, only 1.5 mil thick. KH-8 averaged about 9,000 frames per mission. Some missions as high as 24,000. Another innovation was the roll joint section between the payload and the Agena vehicle. The roll joint allowed the camera unit to swing from target to target, while the Agena kept everything stable and on course. The KH-8 images were extraordinarily sharp in detail. The field of view was very narrow, not unlike looking through a straw at a wall-sized map. Together, Corona and Gambit provided complementary reconnaissance capabilities. Corona performed the wide area, search and locate function, and Gambit focused in close for the technical details. With the success of Corona and Gambit, intelligence analysts were convinced that what the country really needed was the area coverage of Corona and the resolution of Gambit within a single system. In 1971, the NRO launched its next-generation wide-area search imagery spacecraft. Hexagon, or KH-9, was much larger than Corona, or either of the Gambits. At 60 feet long and 10 feet in diameter, the payload vehicle has significantly more capacity and capability. The primary camera system was panoramic, with a pair of counter-rotating stereoscopic cameras, one looking forward and one looking toward the rear. It could photograph with black and white, infrared false color, and natural color film. A second camera system, specifically tasked with terrain mapping and geodesy, was mounted up front on some missions, complete with its own film supply and recovery vehicle. Because of Hexagon's increased capabilities, longer missions and increased photography were possible. One of the last Hexagon missions completed 271 days on orbit and captured 1,722 images. From the first successful Corona mission in 1960 to the last successful Hexagon mission in 1984, film return satellites provided extremely valuable intelligence, which proved essential in assessing the development and deployment of Soviet and Chinese ICBMs, assessing the Soviets' ground order of battle for Central Europe and the Sino-Soviet border, monitoring the SALT I treaty, monitoring a Soviet defense industrial complex and specific weapon systems, assessing the Soviet effort to land a man on the moon, monitoring nuclear weapons programs in the USSR, China, and others, assessing Soviet denial and deception, photo mapping denied areas with extreme accuracy, and monitoring Soviet export shipments of weapons to others. Corona, Gamma, and Hexagon all proved remarkable achievements. But remember this, these highly complex and unique systems were conceived, invented, and developed in the 1950s and were first flown and operated in 1960. Think about the state of technology in daily life back in the 50s and 60s. This technology was so advanced, it remained unmatched for decades.
Okay, I hope everyone enjoyed that film and could hear it. We had a little difficulty here getting it started, but I think we got those problems worked out. This particular program had an extreme security cover on it. We built the camera optics at our optical facilities in Connecticut, and we assembled the camera at a new facility that we built nearby. The building, which housed 10 acres under one roof, had no windows except those in the cafeteria, which was the only small area that was unclassified. During the Cuban hijacking, it prompted the agency to make us stop using aircraft to get back and forth from vendors. We would have California meetings and we'd have to go there and return by train. So it made these meetings quite a bit longer. The security was so tight that we had a IBM 360 computer. It's a big total room computer, and it was inside a safe. You walked in a safe like you were into the First National Bank of whatever, and the room just extended on and on and on. And in there were all the tape drives and disk drives and everything else that made up the computer. We had our own telephone system, which was completely isolated from the rest of the company. And we even had our own telephone techs so that we could move the phones and do everything that we needed to do with phones. We even had an on-site barber shop so that you could, in your busy schedule, could call up, schedule a haircut, go down to this one small area, which was unclassified, get a haircut, and could be right back on a job in 15 or 20 minutes. So let's do a little history on spying. It's been done for a long time. Here we're looking at Napoleon, and they're using balloons to spy on their enemies. So spying is often called the second oldest profession. Washington had his disappearing ink he used. Today we use satellites. They use the latest technology. So the results improved as our surveillance vehicles, cameras, and film improved. As World War II started, the spying got enhanced at every level. And clearly the victories we had at Midway and during the North Atlantic battles were a direct result of spying. Breaking the Japanese code allowed us to set up a trap at Midway, which put the Japanese fleet behind us from that point on. The British code breakers were tracking the German subs using their own communications, and that allowed us to eventually win the battle for the North Atlantic. So lives were at stake, battles were determined, the war's outcome was on the line. So after World War II, we wound up a nation in fear. Russia and US were struggling for world dominance. Nuclear weapon production increased. There were new bombers, subs, and missiles, and the Pentagon kept wanting more because they didn't know what the Russians really had. So the Pearl Harbor shock was, Eisenhower stated, we almost lost World War II at Pearl Harbor, and he didn't want it to happen again. He had a science advisory board, which was shown in the film. What wasn't particularly obvious is one of the members of the board was Edwin Land, who founded and was the inventor of Polaroid, was part of that commission. And what they recommended was satellite surveillance, electronic imaging, stable platforms, data receiving stations. But this was all in 1955. None of this technology existed and had to be invented. So how were they going to do it? Well, Eisenhower pursued the diplomatic solution with open skies. The CIA flew along Russia's border using vehicles that could look in across the border optically and electronically to see what the Soviets were doing near the border. They could look in approximately 100 miles with the optical systems. Meanwhile, the CIA and Air Force were jointly developing both the U-2 and the SR-71 to become the new reconnaissance aircraft out of Lockheed's Skunk Works. At the same time, they were working on the satellite technology and improving reconnaissance systems in general and electronic imaging. So here are the two vehicles that were being developed by Lockheed, the U-2 and the SR-71. The U-2, by the way, has many, many versions. This is a common version, single cockpit, but there was a double cockpit version, and there were different configurations of the U-2. So the agency realized that these new systems were going to take some time. So the CIA looked for interim solutions. So the agency lacked their own internal technical expertise. They would use the vendors to create ideas that they funded. One of the ideas was to release weather balloons that flew over Russia carrying cameras to be retrieved in the Pacific Ocean. And the other idea that came up was to instead of having electronic systems, use a film-based satellite system and recover the films. The weather balloons were not very successful. The Soviets were going after them with aircraft and missiles, and we wound up retrieving only 34 out of 516 weather balloons and camera systems. They planned on 3 or 4 film systems to fill the gap while the new systems were being developed. And this was considered a reasonable piece of work because the same technology was going to be needed for the new systems. So the CIA interim film camera, Richard Bissell, had asked Boston University to design the cameras and had Fairchild Camera build them. But BU wanted to get out of the spy business. Now, I'm going to stop here for a second and tell you how BU got into the spy business, or at least how I believe they got into the spy business. There aren't too many records around to tell you what happened. But when World War II broke out, Over on the other side of the Charles River at Harvard University, there was an astronomer working at the Harvard Observatory. And he was a world-renowned astronomer, but he was also world-renowned as a lens designer. And his name was Jim Baker. And when the war broke out, he volunteered to design reconnaissance cameras for the Army Air Corps. To support him, Harvard created or built up a optics lab that would fabricate the lenses that he came up with for his designs. And there was a group in there that would assemble the lenses, put them into cameras, and test them out. When the war came to a conclusion in 1945, Jim went back to astronomy, and Harvard wanted to disband the optical lab. And for reasons I don't know or understand, BU decided they would pick them up and brought them over to the other side of the river, creating what became known as the BU research labs. So what happened now was in 1957, a company was suddenly created named iTech, and was led by a former OSS officer, Richard Langhorne, and it got financing from one of the Rockefellers. And although there's no evidence that the CIA was directly involved in the creation of this company, there's some indications that they probably were pushing the levers behind the scenes. Because overnight, 300 of these BU engineers that were working for the research labs were suddenly transferred to iTech. And iTech takes over both the camera design and manufacturing. And this program was called Corona. So the early days, the first rockets are literally blowing up on the launch pad left and right. They failed to get any off. And then Gary Francis Powell gets shot down over Russia in May of 1960. 3 months later, and this should have been launch number 13, by the way, returns the first film. The next system photographed more of Russia than had ever been photographed in the past. Their findings, they found 64 airfields and 26 surface-to-air missile sites, previously unknown. It became obvious that the satellite film system would certainly work for the short term. So how'd they get the film back? Film canisters were deorbited and parachuted over Hawaii. C-119s, which are called the flying boxcars, would snatch the canister out of the air. They wanted to be sure the Soviets didn't get the film, so each canister had a dissolvable plug, which would send the film to the bottom in 24 hours if the C-119 missed and the canister wound up in the water. But generally they didn't miss, and the film is flown directly to Higham, where it was developed, quickly evaluated, and sent to NPEC, which was in Washington, D.C., in downtown Washington to boot. This organization has been renamed, and it's the National Geospatial Interpretation Center now. So here's some pictures. Here's a canister parachuting down. It's heading down towards Earth. And here's the C-119 snatching it right out of the air. So success changes everything. Corona showed that the Soviet Union was not about to attack. The nuclear warfare finally started subsiding. And they created the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, in 1961. based on the success of this Corona program. So they take over all the overhead reconnaissance, but they let the CIA continue to manage the Corona program. But the electronic camera development continued under NRO. ITAC worked to improve the Corona capabilities. So what they do, they added a second camera so they would have stereo panoramic photography. They added a second capsule so to increase the amount of on-orbit time. Kodak produced thinner films. Films were made with an acetate base until this point, and Kodak came up with a polyester base, which allowed them to increase the footage from 8,000 feet to 16 to 32,000 feet, thus increasing the on-orbit time. They also provided color and false color films to provide better intelligence. Resolution improvements with better lenses, better mechanics, and better film. So here's the depiction of what was going on. This is an Agena rocket that's flying along in a polar orbit, and you can see there's a forward-looking and a rear-looking camera, and they're taking panoramic photographs of the Earth in a swipe across the path. Here's the maneuver that they perform to eject the capsule. They have to pitch it down, and then they float it out and have to spin to get it to deorbit. And then the C-119 comes in and picks it up. So the CIA pours money into ITAC for more systems. Wall Street says, hey, what's going on there? You guys are making a ton of money. And what are you doing for that money? And who's your customers? But ITAC can't tell them. So they start buying companies to hide the money. And some of these companies fail. Bluntly, they just fall right off the earth. They bought Photostat, and that was a big expense on their part. And it almost toppled ITAC, but they poured more money into it, and they came up with a product which actually performed well during the early 60s. That product was called Plate Master. So, as you saw in the video, we had both Corona and the wide area coverage, while Gambit provided the close-ups. Kodak was the manufacturer of Gambit. The polar orbit circles the Earth and is stable in that Earth environment, while the Earth is rotating below it. So as the satellite swirls around the Earth shows it another part of it, on each and every orbit. We wound up photographing the entire Earth, and so both military and non-military images were recorded for later analysis. The Bay of Pigs happens just as JFK is taking office, and he kills or cancels support, both naval and air support, that the CIA had planned for the invasion of Cuba. So the invasion fails, and Kennedy calls Bessel into his office. Says, "Look," he says, "I know that my actions probably doomed the invasion." He says, "But we've got to have somebody who's going to take the blame for this, and you are the director of operations for covert operations. So you're out. You're dead. you're gone." Now, Bissell was the one who would go to the vendors and get the vendors to provide the ideas and the engineering on how these programs would work. So with Bissell gone, the agency decides to start its own in-house engineering. So as the video describes, the agency wants one system to do both search and close-up. High-tech creates a does-all design, but they run into a clash with the agency over a design detail. I mean, this is, I know what the detail was, and it was trivial. And I can't believe that they could not agree to build this system for the agency. But with them deadlocked like that, the agency went out to find a new vendor, and it found PerkinElmer. So PerkinElmer, after a year's study of the iTech design, agrees to build the Hexagon KH9 system. It's a 2-camera system with better resolution and 4 return capsules. The film load increases to 115,000 feet per side. That's 23 miles of film on each camera. It replaces both Corona and Gambit in a single system. They plan 20 missions. 19 are very successful. The 20th one fails to reach orbit. It explodes at the launch pad, and they lost the system. So it was called Big Bird. Now, just to give you a reference, down in the lower right corner, you can see the back of a human being, a technician, standing underneath that platform. He's probably 6 foot tall, and you can see the size of this thing is gigantic. It is really a huge, huge system. This is another look at it. You can see from the caption that it's a 60-foot long, 10-foot diameter. The film capsules are in the front with the ready to be dropped out. The cameras in the middle and near the back end is where the film supply is. So graphing is also not one of the major skills that the agency has, but this one, maybe you can see, it's the ground resolution that they are achieving. And the first systems were up around 3.5 feet, and they got progressively better as they went towards the end of the program. And they got down into the 2-foot range in resolution. So the improvements continued. The mapping camera is added. I didn't think much about the mapping camera when I first heard about it, but then I was told that cruise missiles use the data to terrain map and to find their target. So from that standpoint, it was a very important addition. The improved mechanical electrical systems result in 2-foot ground resolution, and the on-orbit times are now stretched to 275 days. Image enhancement pulls more data from the film. That is the process of digitizing the film and applying algorithms to enhance the information that's on the film. For example, most things that are on the ground that were built by humans have straight lines. And so one of the things they do is they enhance the film so that they look for lines, and they can pick up where even relatively small buildings and objects are that were made by man. So the other improvements are, now that they've got an operating system, they actually took advantage of it to look at high altitude density measurements. They had not a good model for what was going on at the high altitudes. ELINT, which stands for electrical intelligence, were added, and they were mapping the Soviet air defense radars, eavesdropping on voice communications, and tapping into the missile and satellite telemetry. They even had some scientific subsystems that were available. Now, one of the capsules didn't make it. The capsule sinks to the ocean bottom at 16,000 feet when the parachute fails to open. The agency gets the DSRV, which stands for Deep Submergence Rescue Vehicle, to go to retrieve the film. They work at it for 9 months and find it, pull it in, but the seawater had deteriorated the film and no images were recorded. So it was a waste of time. So the last of the systems was in May of '84. In '86, they launched the other system, which failed. Hexagon was declassified in September 2011. The total cost of the program was $3.26 billion. Satellite or surveillance continues today with classified electronic systems, which I was never briefed on, so I can't get into. The results were stunning. In 1959, the Pentagon wanted to do a preemptive strike to destroy Russia but Corona comes along and says, hey, you don't need to do that. And as a result, the United States and Russia signed the SALT and SALT II agreements, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, and nuclear growth is now controlled. So the threat of war was reduced and the nuclear warfare subsided. So the bonus of this is that the entire Earth was recorded on film, both by Corona and Hexagon. The Corona program was declassified in 1995 and gave Earth scientists images frozen in time of the Earth in the 1960s. Now they can look at the 1960s and compare them to today and decide, what's happening, what's changing. So that's the end of the presentation. You can prepare for your questions now by raising your hand. Agar has put up the survey. I have two questions that I'm going to start with. So I'll let Agar take it from here, but I'll bring it back and we'll work on these two questions.
We have Mr. Ray who raised his hand. I'm allowing you to speak right now. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, this is Ray Boulay. I'm curious whether you were involved with the Midas missile launch detection satellite.
No, I was not. I was vaguely aware of it, but no, I was not directly involved in that.
Thank you.
Mr. Backrack, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Wonderful talk. The CIA seemed to have two components. One is the data collection systems like you worked on. And the other is the covert operations that have probably caused more problems than they helped, considering Iran, Guatemala, etc. In your experience or knowledge, did the covert operations provide any needed assistance to the intelligence gathering, or they really could have been in two separate agencies?
Well, thanks for that question. The answer is I don't know directly whether there was any assistance there. But one of the things ITech had us engineers do was to take a class in photo interpretation. And it was amazing what you could learn from these photographs, these aerials. And it turned out that if you knew a little extra information, something that might not have been directly associated with something in the picture, but you knew some other information, you could then come up with conclusions or deductions that would really help. So that's where the human intelligence would really come in handy and provide the photo interpreters with a more enhanced way of looking at their images. I'll give you an example. What they did for us is they showed us an aerial photograph of iTech, and you could see from the shadows that the photo was taken about noontime. And the parking lot was about half full. And they asked us, what day of the week was this picture taken? And we all looked at them and said, well, how can we tell what day of the week this is? And finally, they said, well, if you notice the parking lot is half full, and on Wednesdays we get paid, and most people go out to the bank to cash their check. So it was Wednesday. Anyway, so there's an example of where a little extra intelligence really provides, more information about what's going on.
Mr. Bailey, go ahead and please unmute yourself.
Yes, hi. I was just wondering, you mentioned that Wall Street got interested in iTech and where their money was coming from. Was that a company that was actually publicly traded?
Oh, yes. iTech, when I joined the company in 1965, and the company had jumped up into the Fortune 500 list, and they were about 250th on the list. And here's a company which was literally founded 8 years prior to that. And so there was definitely Wall Street interest in there.
Okay, thank you.
Any additional questions, folks?
Aga, if you don't have anyone else, I have the two questions here.
Go ahead. All right.
One of the things I mentioned in the presentation is the use of false color film that was used in these satellites. And you may wonder, what is false color? What does that do? First, I'll tell you what a color film is. Color film has 3 emulsions on it. Each emulsion is sensitive to a different part of the optical spectrum. One would be sensitive to the blue lights. Another layer would be sensitive to green, and the third layer would be sensitive to red lights. So when they process the film and you look at it in transparency, you see all the colors because they come superimposed, and those are your primary colors, providing you with a uniform color thing. In a false color one, they generally take the red layer and change it so that it's sensitive into the infrared, the near infrared. What this does is make objects that are reflective of infrared very, very bright red. Vegetation turns out, if it's healthy vegetation, turns out to be an excellent IR reflector. And you'll see the trees and plantings around the world in really brilliant red colors. But if there is a attempt to hide something with a camouflage net that's to the naked eye looks like it is vegetation, on these films it sticks out like a sore thumb, and you know that that whoever's got that is hiding something. So it's a very good way to find things that they're trying to hide. The other question that somebody asked me when we were doing a dry run the other day is, whatever happened to Gary Francis Powell? So they, in the film, they mentioned that it was their first attempt to fly across the entire
Exchanged for a Soviet spy.
And they flew out of Pakistan and headed virtually due north across Russia. The Russians had known for over a year that they were doing this, and they had nothing to stop the U-2s. So they kept firing missiles at him. They fired a total of 14 missiles at Gary Francis Powell. And the first few obviously missed. They launched a MiG-19 after him. And one of the missiles hit the MiG, and the pilot died from that. There was another aircraft in the area which was unarmed, but it had high-speed capability. It was capable of an excess of Mark 1. And they sent it after Powell. And he was instructed to ram the U-2. He missed. The U-2 flies pretty slowly. He flies at only like 0.6 Mach, or about 300 miles an hour. And the other guy was going at 1.1. So he missed, but one of the missiles near the end of the flight did catch him, blew off his wing, his right wing, and part of the tail. And the plane started spiraling down from the high altitude he was at. And it was flying, it was spinning down, upside down, and he was unable to get out or to activate the self-destruct button until the canopy flew off, and then he fell out of the aircraft. And he parachuted down and was captured immediately. He was put on trial and sentenced to prison. Meanwhile, back in Georgia, his wife is out carousing around, is drinking, has become a problem with drinking, and is having an affair. She is pulled over by the police with erratic driving, and the agency gets them to put her into a psychiatric situation where she is under lock and key. So, because they were afraid that the Soviets would let Gary know what was going on, and he might, in fact, divulge more classified information, than he had already. He was exchanged for a Soviet spy about 2 years after he got shot down. There was a famous movie, which Tom Hanks is in, called The Bridge of Spies, where they work through the negotiations to do the prisoner exchange. When he got back to the United States, he went to work for Lockheed as a test pilot and stayed there until 1970. Then he took a job as a traffic helicopter pilot in the LA area. And on one of his trips with a photographer, he ran out of fuel, crashed, killing both of them. Now, the story goes that he had a fuel gauge on the helicopter, which wasn't working. And his mechanic, unbeknownst to Gary, fixed it. So when he saw that the gauge was showing empty, he didn't pay attention to it, and it was really empty. And thus he died from that particular poor situation. So that's all I have. Anyone else have any more questions?
Yes, Mr. Backrag just raised hand, and also Mr. Boulay. So go ahead, Mr. Backrag, and ask your question.
Yes. I worked for, I have a question and a comment. I was working for GE Reentry Systems in the mid 60s, late 60s. And the scuttlebutt we had was that you guys, ITEC had raided Eastman Kodak for a lot of engineers. And they were saying ITEC stood for I took Eastman Kodak or something like that. Was that any of that true?
That was the popular rumor running around Boston, where they were located in Lexington, Mass. And the answer is no, they were not. But they were actively hiring, so they had feelers out throughout the industry, and I'm sure that they pulled in a few people from Kodak. But there was it was not a a planned thing like that. So
And then I have a comment, just,
sure.
so I worked on the biosatellite, which NASA used to send monkeys into space.
Okay.
And we also used a Air Force plane to catch the satellite as it returned.
Okay.
And at least my department that I was in, we had no knowledge that the Air Force was doing that with film capsules. And so was that part secret? Because I never had heard about it when I was working in that type of work.
Yes. Now, if I'm not mistaken, that was the Discoverer series. Is that correct?
As far as the launch vehicle, I was involved with the reentry vehicle. So
Okay. But I think they called it the Discovery system, and they were launching monkeys out of Vandenberg, and a lot of them were blowing up. But that was the cover story, basically on they were giving to the press. But in there, of course, was the film, the cameras, and the films, so that they were running those together. Yes.
okay, thank you.
Mr. Boulay, go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question.
Here, I have a question and a comment.
Sure.
Regarding PerkinElmer, Ken, did you work on any of the optics for the black aircraft
For the SR-71?
or the U-2?
Yeah, I did not directly. I've heard that they were there, that they were built by PerkinElmer, but I was not directly involved with those.
Okay, and then my comment, you just made me think of another comment. It's kind of amusing, but what Ken is saying, that he knew it was there but didn't work on it, that was very, very typical of companies back then that were involved in those programs. There was an operation next to me that it took me 3 or 4 years to have any idea of what they were doing. I was working for a company called Baird Atomic, which also did satellite optics and did optics for the U-2 and the SR-71. But I have an anecdote about Gary Powers, if anybody is interested and if we have the time.
Yes, we do have the time. Go ahead.
Okay. I worked with Gary Powers after he came back. I don't mean that we were hand in hand drinking buddies or anything, but I was out to North Base at Edwards Air Force Base, and as Ken said, Gary was a test pilot for Lockheed. And one of his regular jobs was if a U-2 had been maintained in Burbank at the Skunk Works, he would fly it back to North Base. And then I'd be in a debriefing room with him talking about the equipment and all that. And a couple of times sat next to him in the cafeteria at these long tables. He was quite a decent guy. The stories about his death in the press, I don't agree with. I think they changed over the years, because I was quite close to the program at the time he died. And it's quite a nice story, actually. As Ken said, he lost power in the helicopter. I would have thought it was an engine failure, but the fuel shortage fits into that. Well, the story that his colleagues were telling back then is that it was about 5 of 8 in the morning, and he was auto-rotating the helicopter down from altitude to what looked like a clearing next to a building. The clearing turned out to be a grammar school. And at 5 of 8, it was loaded with kids who were just hearing the bell to go into class. Gary, being a pretty brave guy, used the last bit of speed from the helicopter and drove the helicopter into the side of a brick building rather than landing in the field where the kids were. And based on the people who knew him intimately and told me that story, I think that's what really happened rather than what's been printed since then. And that's all I have.
Ray, I sort of agree with you. From what I've read, that sounds typical for him. Because when I saw in print that he ran out of fuel, I knew that they should be able to auto gyrate and be able to safely land. So that explains why he didn't. So thank you. That was a very good comment.
We have one more question from Mrs. Tana Gray. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm interested to know, with all that you've said, what do we say now about what's happening currently, and how much of the past of all those research and all of that you did is happening, and what's happening now, if you know that?
Well, thank you for your question. As I alluded to, or not even alluded to, I've just said flatly that the systems today are all electronic, so that there is no film anymore, and the systems are up there, and they can record an image and relay it back to Earth essentially instantly. So they don't have to wait to capture a film and worry that they'll miss it or have any mishaps that way. So the systems are now working very, very efficiently, and they can put a system up for a long period of time and don't have to worry about running out of film, for example. So I know that they are working. I don't know who makes them or anything about them or their capabilities, but I've got to believe that they are doing even better than what we did back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They've got to have improved a great deal with the ability to change focal lengths. I'm sure they're using some sort of zoom lens type of technology to get just what the information they need. So I would think that they're pulling that in very, very nicely nowadays. Did I answer your question completely?
Yeah. Yes, and I just ask one more quick question on that. The news reports not too long ago, when Trump was before Trump left office, that some kind of a spy plane had been torn apart or something by our government. Do you know anything about that? Does that have any part of what you were talking about at all?
No, it does not have anything to do with what I was speaking of. I know that there was a vehicle that was launched and it was in orbit for an extended period of time, months, as I recall, and it was listed as a reconnaissance or a classified program, and nothing was ever said about it, and it was brought back to Earth, and it came back successfully, I heard. So other than that.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
Mr. Boulay, go ahead and unmute yourself.
I might add to Ked's response. I've heard exactly that story from a Harvard astronomer 3 or 4 years ago, and kind of in the same context. Gee, this thing has happened and nobody knows what it really is, but it seems to have happened more than once now.
Thank you so much.